Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Islamic Audiobooks collection. I will be reading When the Moon Split by Safiur R Mubarakpuri, which we downloaded from kalamullah.com. Let's read.
Page 174. Many of the bereaved Muslims bore their losses with patience and took comfort in knowing that their Prophet, peace be upon him, was safe, although they had lost their own loved ones in the bargain. The following incident illustrates the priority the Muslims placed on the Prophet, peace be upon him's safety. A group of Muslims returning from the battle encountered a woman from the tribe of Banu Dinar. Her husband, brother, and father had all been killed at Uhud. When she was told of each of their deaths, she responded each time, "First, tell me about the Prophet, peace be upon him." The people replied, "Thanks to Allah, he is safe." But the woman was not satisfied with the men's assurances and asked to see for herself how the Prophet, peace be upon him, was. When the people brought her to him, she said simply, "Now that you are safe, every grief has vanished." Back in Medina, the Muslims spent the night on high alert. After all, they were still in a state of emergency. Exhausted and wounded, they were also overcome by deep sorrow and remorse at the actions of a few who had risked the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself. They all insisted on guarding the Prophet, peace be upon him. The Prophet, on the other hand, felt that it was far more important to monitor the retreating enemy's movements carefully. He wanted to be prepared in case of a surprise attack on Medina. The very next morning, the Prophet, peace be upon him, sent a crier to announce that all those who had fought in the Battle of Uhud should prepare to pursue the enemy. Every Muslim who had fought at Uhud the day before followed the Prophet, peace be upon him, out of Medina, regardless of fatigue and injury. Thus, they set out from Medina and camped at Hamra al-Asad, 8 miles away. The pagans were camped at Roha, 36 miles from Medina, holding a war council. Much recrimination was traded as the troops berated their leaders. Why had they squandered the advantage by not entering Medina? At this moment, the Muslim camp was also pondering strategy. Ma'bad bin Abi Sa'id Khazai, who was a well-wisher of the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to him at Hamra al-Asad and commiserated about the events at Uhud. The Prophet, peace be upon him, asked him to approach Abu Sufyan and use scare tactics to head the pagans off. Ma'bad accordingly reached Roha, where the mood was in favour of returning to attack Medina. Ma'bad dismayed the pagans with his description of the ferocity of the Muslims and their extensive preparations for a new encounter. "Muhammad has come out with a horde the like of which I have never seen. They are intent on revenge, and their mood is terrifyingly bloodthirsty. I think you will spot their vanguard appearing from behind this hill." The ruse worked. The Meccan troops lost their bravado, and Abu Sufyan confined his response to a similar scare campaign. He decided to do some sabre-rattling of his own. He instructed a caravan to scare the Muslims by saying that the Meccans were ready for another round. Meanwhile, Abu Sufyan and his soldiers hurried back to Mecca. Having come so close to defeat, the subdued Muslims who heard this warning were prepared to fight on. The threat of a renewed attack only stiffened their resolve. They responded by quoting the following verse. The hypocrites said, "Verily, the pagans have gathered against you, so fear them." But this increased the Muslims in faith, and they replied, "Allah is sufficient for us, and He is the best to determine our affairs." Qur'an 3, verse 173. There was no further volley of threats, and the resulting calm is best described in the next verse. Thus they returned with the blessings and favour of Allah. No evil touched them, and they sought nothing but Allah's pleasure, and Allah is magnificent beyond measure. Qur'an 3, verse 174. The Battle of Uhud had proved the Muslims' vulnerability. The pagans smelled blood and did not miss a single chance to gore their wounded enemy. In subsequent events, the Muslims experienced several painful losses, some of which are outlined below. The incident of Raji. In Safiur 4AH, a delegation of the Adal and Qara tribes came to the Prophet, peace be upon him. They mentioned a surge of interest in Islam among their people who wanted to know more about the faith. The Prophet, peace be upon him, sent 10 of his companions, headed by Asim bin Thabit, may Allah be pleased with him. The Muslims, who had set out to teach the tribes the basic tenets of the faith and the Qur'an, learnt a bitter lesson about the treachery of the polytheists. At Raji, the Adal and Qara set a branch of the Hudayl tribe upon the Muslims. Nearly 100 of their archers besieged the 10 Muslims on a hill. They assured the Muslims on oath that they would not kill them, but Asim refused to descend, preferring instead to take on the enemy. 7 of the Muslims were killed in the encounter. Again, the attackers pledged that they would not kill the remaining 3 Muslims, who then surrendered and descended the hill. As they were being bound, one of the 3 commented, "This is the first act of treachery." He then resisted his captor's attempts to tie him and was killed. The remaining 2, Khubayb bin Aday and Zayd bin Dathina, were carried to Mecca and sold as slaves to their old tormentors, the Quraysh. Their lives were now no longer their own. Khubayb had killed Harith bin Amr bin Nawfal in the Battle of Badr, and now Harith's son laid claim to Khubayb's life. Khubayb suffered in prison for some time, and then he was carried to Tanim to be slain. Before his execution, he prayed 2 rakahs. He prayed for Allah's wrath to overtake his killers, and as he faced his death, he recited 2 couplets. "I care not if I am slain a Muslim, and I care not which side of mine is brutalized. This is for Allah, and if He so wills, He will bless the flesh of every joint." Abu Sufyan asked Khubayb, "Don't you wish Muhammad were in your place and we had killed him while you were safe with your family?" Khubayb countered, "By Allah, I would not wish to be with my family if in return Muhammad were to be even pricked by a thorn." Khubayb was dead, and now Zayd bin Dathina awaited death at the hands of Safwan bin Umayyah. Safwan was given the right to slay Zayd in retribution for the death of his father, Umayyah bin Mahrath, at Badr. Some Muslim sources have attributed the above-quoted verbal encounter between Abu Sufyan and Khubayb to Zayd bin Dathina. The dead Muslims on the Mount of Raji were also regarded as trophies by the Quraysh, who sent their men to retrieve Asim's body, but they drew back because of a swarm of hornets buzzing over the body. In this way, Allah protected Asim's body from desecration at the hands of the polytheists. Asim had sworn never to touch a polytheist nor be touched by one, and his Lord had upheld his vow. The tragedy at Bir Ma'una. About the same period, the Muslims suffered another setback, more tragic than that at Raji. Abu Bara Amir bin Malik, who was known as Mal'ab al-Insa, one who plays with lances, sought an audience with the Prophet, peace be upon him, who then invited him to Islam. Abu Bara neither accepted nor rejected the Prophet, peace be upon him's counsel. He chose instead to volunteer his own opinion about the inclination of the people of Najd towards Islam. He suggested that if the Prophet, peace be upon him, sent some of his companions to Najd, the people there would enter Islam. He also assured the Prophet, peace be upon him, that the Muslims would be under his protection. The Prophet, peace be upon him, sent off a contingent of 70 Muslims who were well versed in the Qur'an. They camped at Bir Ma'una, and Haram bin Malhan went to Amr bin Tufail, a bitter enemy of Allah, with a letter from the Prophet, peace be upon him. Amir's response was not to read the letter himself, but to order his servant to do so. He took Haram unawares and pierced the latter's body with his lance. With his last breath, Haram sighed, Allahu Akbar, by the Lord of the Kaaba, I have succeeded in my mission. Amir then called out to the tribe of Banu Amir to attack the rest of the Muslims, but they refused to break the pledge of protection made by Abu Bara. Amr then called upon Banu Sulaim and some of its sub-tribes such as Ral, Zakwan, Layhan and Usayya, who readily came to besiege the companions and put all of them to death, save Ka'b bin Zayd and Amr bin Umayyah. Ka'b bin Zayd was wounded and left for dead. Later, he was rescued from the scene of the carnage and he recovered, only to be martyred in the Battle of the Trench. Amr bin Umayyah Damri had been grazing his camels along with Mundir bin Uqba when he saw the vultures hovering at Bir Ma'una. Instantly, he guessed the outcome of the Muslims' visit to Amr bin Tufail. Mundir rushed to the spot to rescue his brother Muslims. He took on the enemy and fought until he was overcome. As for Amr bin Umayyah, he was taken captive but proved to be more fortunate than the rest of his Muslim brothers. When Amr bin Tufail was told that the prisoner belonged to the Mudir tribe, he simply took off a lock of Amr's hair as a trophy and freed him in fulfillment of a vow made by his mother. Thus, it was that Amr bin Umayyah escaped death, and he immediately headed toward Medina. On the way, he came across two men from Banu Kilab at Qarqara. Taking them to be enemies, Amr killed them both, although they had with them a covenant of peace from the Prophet, peace be upon him. Back in Medina, he informed the Prophet, peace be upon him, of what he had done. The Prophet, peace be upon him's only words were, "You have killed two such men whose blood I must redeem." Both the incidents at Bir Ma'una and Raji deeply anguished the Prophet, peace be upon him. He had sent 2 missions of peace, and both had ended tragically in the same month. It is said that he received the news of both the tragedies the same night. He found solace in prayer, qunut, supplicating for the martyred Muslims, and calling down Allah's punishment on their killers. For 30 days, each morning after Fajr, the Prophet, peace be upon him, prayed against the murderers until at last he received a revelation. Allah informed him that he had indeed met his martyred slaves. He was pleased with them, and that they had been no less pleased with their Lord's treatment of them. Other matters demanded the Prophet, peace be upon him's attention. Amr bin Umayyah's killing of the 2 men from Banu Kilab had to be redressed. If no blood money was forthcoming, the Muslims would be deemed guilty of violating a pact, and more bloodshed could be expected. Consequently, the Prophet, peace be upon him, went to Banu Nadir along with a few of his companions to ask them to contribute towards the blood money. They said to him, "Abu Qasim, we shall do accordingly. Take your seat here. We will fulfill your need." The Prophet, peace be upon him, waited while the Jews consulted privately with one another. Unfortunately, Shaitan prevailed over their honour, and they decided to murder the Prophet, peace be upon him. They said to each other, "Who will carry this millstone and drop it on him?" Up rose Amr bin Jash to carry out the deed. In the meantime, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, sat waiting for his hosts to come back with their decision, Jibreel, peace be upon him, descended and revealed the plot to him. The Prophet, peace be upon him, hurried away and set out for the road to Medina, where he was joined by his companions. Treachery by allies who were bound by a treaty is never a light matter. By plotting against the Prophet, peace be upon him, Banu Nadir had demonstrated that they could not coexist with the Muslims. Naturally, the Prophet, peace be upon him, wished to end the alliance, and based on the action of the Jews, assumed that they were at war with one another. He therefore sent Muhammad bin Muslimah to issue an ultimatum to the Jews. Since they had forfeited their right to live with the Muslims, they were to leave Medina within 10 days. Any Jew found after the lapse of the deadline would be put to death. After receiving the notice, the Jews began preparing to leave.
Jazakallah khair for listening.